My name is Christopher Young Park. I go by Chris. I am 51 years old and I was born in Grand Coulee, Washington. After my father had worked practicing rural medicine for a number of years, he wanted to return to academic medicine, and so we moved to Seattle. So that was probably when I was 3 years old. Yeah, it was about 2 to 3 years. And then we moved to Kansas City, Kansas. You know, we had a lot of neighborhood friends. None of them were Korean or Asian. This was Kansas City in the early 70s. But it seemed like we had a pretty normal childhood, meaning me and my brothers. A lot of our friends were from the neighborhood. I think we spent a lot of time just together as brothers and in our family. We probably were living sort of the model minority myth, you know, and knowing that we were so rare, but at the same time, people did point to us as sort of being, you know, whatever, good citizens, good students. I actually saw that interestingly, as a positive thing growing up. I didn't view that as a negative thing. Because I guess I didn't feel pressure and judgment from even our own community of, you know, other Asians or Korean Americans. And obviously, most people, when they said something, it was usually positive. We were not a threat. Asians were not a threat to anybody growing up. So like these kinds of ugly things that we see, you know, that in big cities, you know, I'm not saying that they weren't underneath the surface, but we didn't have to face them on a regular basis at all. And I sometimes wonder if that's a better environment to raise a kid. You know, even growing up in Texas, I think there are probably only about 3 incidences that I can remember where somebody actually called me, you know, a racial epithet. I don't really consider most parts of Texas really the South. You know, Texans have their own sort of unique identity, right? So where we grew up, we were not so far out enough in the town, outside of San Antonio. We're still in the suburbs, really firmly within the middle of the suburbs. You know, family in a very decent middle-class neighborhood. People still cared about social grace. They didn't go out of their way to make people feel uncomfortable. They were always kind to one another. And all of those kinds of things that you associate with sort of Southern or Texan culture, you know, that's what we really experienced by and large. I mean, even now, I do wonder about the South and, you know, could I possibly, like the true South or Southeast, you know, could we live there? And even I have hesitation about it. But having grown up in that place, and, you know, my parents have lived there now for, you know, 46 years, you know, I think they're pretty comfortable there. And, you know, when we visit, I actually feel perfectly fine. Going to college, though, was, you know, I knew it was going to be a change. And when I came up to the Northeast, I was really looking forward to meeting other Korean Americans. And so when I went to college, I was very active in the Asian American community. I actually was really hardcore Korean American Students Association. I was like a co-moderator my sophomore year. I was like running against all these upperclassmen. And, you know, but I always said, I want to do something like substantial. This is like, seems to me just like a purely social thing. We had a Korean American Students Conference hosted on the Yale campus. It's actually started by East Rock Institute back in the early 70s. And then the KSA co-hosted it. And then we created the biggest Korean American student dance party on the East Coast called Blackout. As I look at the communities and as they built up on different coasts and more cities, I see more younger Korean Americans who actually speak Korean way better than I do. And their sort of relationship to their identity as Korea rose, even they have a different viewpoint when it comes to Korea and their identity. After that, there was sort of the wave of migration from the mid-70s to late 70s. And those kids were starting to get into college. And so suddenly most of the kids actually spoke really good Korean. And those students actually had a very different kind of relationship and view about their identity. But there was really this massive shift in the Korean American student body at that time. And there were a lot of discussions about you're either with us or against us. There's a very militant faction that sort of came in. I felt really strongly that was not what I was interested in, right? The idea of everybody being siloed Asian Americans actually started to really bother me. You know, obviously I had my own family, I had my own experiences growing up and our own values and things that we emphasized in our own family. And I think one of the reasons why I kind of shied away from, I think, Korean Americans after a few years in college was that I just didn't really feel like there was a shared sense of value. People, I'm a physician now, but at the time and for even since then, every collegiate conference I ever went and speak to, people complain about how their parents tell them to become a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. And I'm like, very few Korean Americans become doctors. Even back then, out of my class of 55, I think fewer than 5 of us. And I always tell people, what's wrong with being a doctor? It's awesome. If you understand why you're doing it, right? I'm like, where does the influence on education come from? Oh, that's just about making money. I'm like, no. The education was to be able to create better leaders. And those leaders were not only supposed to be concerned about their families, they were supposed to be concerned about society. And people, I think right now, when I talk to younger people, and even when I was younger, I think we misattribute that as being a Western ideal. But this is not a Western ideal. This is, if anything, I think there's a lot of historical evidence that Koreans have believed this and lived it for a very long time. And those are the kinds of stories I would like people to know about, in addition to all of the wonderful successes we have today. Because for me, that made me understand my parents a little bit better, but also said, no, everything that's positive about being Korean is not rooted in something that happened after 1980. But at the same time, I always ask myself, where is the place for people like me who don't speak Korean very well? Mm-hmm. And, I've struggled with this my entire adult life, trying to do stuff in the Korean American community, but also knowing that I'm not the person necessarily to go reach out to first generation Korean Americans, right, in their communities. I could do things behind the scenes or, do other things to support. But I think for people my age with my type of background, I think for a lot of those folks, it's hard for them to really get their boots on the ground. Like they can support things financially, but really sort of doing the hard work at the level of the community, I think it's very difficult for them. Our parents were completely ill-equipped, right, to educate us. I think pretty much most first generation are ill-equipped because they have a different set of priorities. The trauma, of of colonialization and war. Most Koreans only remember that part of Korean history, right? The part that they lived. But who we are as a culture and the positive things that we derive from identity, we're allowed to go before then, but they were sort of brainwashed into believing, right, that everything was just utter crap, right? Before the Japanese came, it was just utter crap. I could see how that's influenced our parents' generation. And their inability then to sort of counteract that. How could they? They were children when they were indoctrinated, right? And even indirect ways, even those who didn't live directly under Japanese colonial rule. There were still those effects. What I find interesting is that when I say that, sometimes people really challenge me on that, and they talk about individual identity and trying to not generalizing. But if there's nothing generalizable, then I don't think you have group identity. My dad was like an amazing role model. Here was this man who had persevered through so much strife. To my mother's credit, she would remind us of this. I actually think that was good because it really put us in a frame of mind where this sense of entitlement was not there. At the end of my 7th grade, there was an award ceremony at the end of the year. And so we went to the store, and Sperry topsiders were very popular, and it was the name brand, and I really wanted to get those. Right? Every kid seemed to have that. And then we went to the store, we looked at the prices, and my mother said, well, we can't afford that. We can get this one. And I was very disappointed because I didn't know it was the store brand. I said something about, how every other kid has that. And my mother said something to me really quite powerful. She said, do you not think that I would get that for you if we could afford it? And no, but she meant it, she did it in the most loving way, And at that moment, I just remembered to myself, thinking to myself, what am I even saying? How could I possibly be saying that to my parents, right? But I remember the 5 really important stories that my mother kept repeating to me about her father and like the 5 things that I'm supposed to remember from those stories. And they're all remarkable stories, you know? You need heroes. And what if they come from your own family? I think that's even kind of even more remarkable and maybe blessed to have that, because then it's really a part of who I am. I hug my kid all the time. You know, where I learned that was from my friends, many of whom had from different cultural backgrounds, where people are much more open with one another. When I interact with their families, the way they would bring me in, right? I was like, why don't we have this? And for my child, you know, we don't hold back. I almost wonder if that could be way too much on the other extreme, only because she's so lovey-dovey with anybody she meets now. I don't think that's a bad thing, actually. But I mean, like, we live in Manhattan, right? I mean, and we know that a lot of the kids she's going to be around are going to come from extreme privilege. Right. I just hope that, you know, that she is not has some warped view of the world because of the people she's around. I mean, in many ways, that's what I like about my upbringing in San Antonio. Understanding that the world is not to be given to you. I'm just hoping that she still has that opportunity to spend enough time with my parents that she will remember them. But that's why this is so important. My name is Chris Park, and this is my Korean American story.